What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over Input Stacks Part 5, which will be the final part for Input Stacks. In fact, it might be the final part ever for Input Stacks. We will occasionally add things to it, but this will probably be the last episode dedicated to it specifically because the other changes we'll be making would be pretty simple at this point. This episode we're going to add and fix up the input stack for player 2, so they can have their own input stack, player 1 and 2. Now, yes, this will probably only be displayed in practice mode, but often in practice mode you can fight a human opponent, or maybe even an AI opponent, and if you want to judge their, see what they're kind of thinking or see what they're doing, use for debugging when you're writing the AI. So this could be beneficial for a few different reasons, but that's not all. That fix is pretty easy with what we already have. We're going to also add diagonal inputs. You can see if I jump left, jump right, or crouch and press left and right, I can do, you see the arrows that pop up. Now, they're a little bit smaller simply because I didn't match the sizes correctly. I didn't account for the difference in size because it was being rotated in the way Unreal imported it. Long story short, I can fix that up in another episode. But basically, I have these diagonal arrows, and if I jump left, well, if I could jump left, there we go, or jump right, then you will also see the up diagonal arrows. So just some things that you might want. You might not need all of them. You might not need any of them. But if you do want these, that's how we're going to add them. And of course, like I said, we're going to do player 2's input stack. I'm also going to show you exceptional attack icons like this. So there you go. You can see the exceptional attack popped up here. That's that black one with the yellow outline. Now, technically, it looks a lot different than that. That's not how I intended for it to look. I wanted a cool, like, dotted line effect. It did not appear that way while I was, when I put it in the game, but I'm not going to change it right now. Just that weird symbol that doesn't seem to match, that's the exceptional attack medium attack. I also have ones for the exceptional attack light and heavy, so you'll see those too. And lastly, I've added a block symbol, which is just two fists, like put together as if he's got his fist in front of his face getting ready to block. So show you how to set up all those as well, and then we'll be good to go with input stacks. So before we get started, if you're not familiar with input stacks or this series in general, I will put a link to the very first episode to the fighting game tutorial right here if you want to catch up to everything we've done. I think we're episode 39. We're pretty far in, so there's quite a bit that we have done at this point. If you're not interested in that, that's okay, but you should catch up on the input stack episodes if you haven't already, because I'm going to be covering more content and going over some of the things that we've already touched in there. So I will leave an iCard right here to the first input stack episode. Alright, so let's get into it today. Now, there's a few things we need to change before we get started. Nothing major, but if we go into our mutant character BP, this is where, if you remember, first of all, to those who don't know, this is our character class. This is our fighter. So we're using the mutant character from Mixamo. And we have these functions in here that we can call in the event graph called add input icon to screen. And once we do that, essentially this means an input has occurred. We're determining if we should display it to the screen or not, and if we do display it to the screen, we determine if it's player 1 or player 2. So if you've been following the series, you'll only have this node right here, the branch, if we should add the input or not, and then P1 add input image. Well, obviously we have to change this so that it accounts for player 1 and player 2. We just literally never did it before. So there's a few ways to do that. The way I like differentiating my characters is to actually determine in the character if they're player 1 or not. And it's a little bit unorthodox, I will say. How we should probably do it and how we're going to be doing it in the future is using a game state. But don't worry, this logic won't change at all as we go on, and this is a lot easier to do right now. I'll be adding player 1 and player 2 logic to the game state in the next episode where we cover multiplayer menus. So that's why I'm not touching it here, but I did want to bring this up here because it's important to differentiate the two. So for now, we're going to have a boolean called isPlayer1, and if it's player 1, then we add the icons in the input stack to player 1's side. If not, we add them to player 2's side. Pretty simple in concept. So let me show you one more thing before we explain how that's done. I should have this open already. I don't know why it's closed. But in my character HUD, you guys probably saw that I had changed, I never resized this, that I had changed this HUD a few episodes back to where we had P1 inputs and P2 inputs here in the HUD. So we had, these are where we want player 1's inputs to be, and these are where we want player 2's inputs to be. Well, this function that we have in the character is just determining which part of the HUD we want to display the input stack icons to. Simple enough. So you don't have to do anything with the HUD. I just wanted to show you that's what we're doing here. And again, if you've been following the series, you already have the references to each of these, but that's how we're determining which one we're going to go to. So we've got P1 inputs and P2 inputs. Then in our mutant character BP, we check it for player 1 or 2, and then add the icon stack images, or the input stack images. Okay, so let's go into the code, and I'll show you exactly what we've done. If we start out in the character's header file, the base character, I'm adding a boolean called isPlayer1. The comment is simple: is this character controlled by player 1? And that's what the boolean essentially is. It's just determining if player 1 controls this character or not, because we want to know whose input stack should be displayed on the left-hand side and whose input stack should be displayed on the right-hand side, and how to differentiate the two, and whose inputs are whose. So again, when we switch this over to the game state, it's going to be, well, whoever's player 1 in the menus and selected their character, that's player 1. Or, you know, if you're in story mode and you're fighting an AI, then you're player 1, not the AI. Things like that. For now, just go ahead and leave this boolean in here, is player 1. Make sure it's blueprint read write. That way we can access it in blueprints. It's the only thing we have to add to the header file. Go up to the top of the CPP file in the constructor where we set all of our default values. Set is player 1 to false, because we don't want to assume it's player 1 by default. That means if this logic doesn't get read, then we just assume it's player 1, which we should not do, because even if we have only 2 characters and you have a 50% shot, it's better to be wrong and then figure out which one is player 1 later than it is to be right that it's player 1 on the case that it is, and then wrong with the others. And I'll show you why that is right now. So in here, in our setup player input component, we were doing some logic to determine, you know, who was player 1 and who was player 2. Because remember, we're supporting both a keyboard and multiple controllers in this game. So if we have the keyboard, we don't want to simply be like, okay, you're player 1 because you pressed the button on the keyboard. Well, that's not necessarily true. It depends on if we are intending to use the keyboard for multiple players, right? That's why we want it to be false. We don't want to assume it's true just because we have one input device or anything like that. You never know. So we want to make sure that in our logic we were already doing, where we check if the game mode's player 1 is equal to this character, because the game mode spawns the character. So the game mode knows who's player 1 and who's player 2. So if in the game mode player 1 is equal to this character that's having their setup player input component function called, then we know we're player 1. So we want to set is player 1 to be true. Else we want to set it to be false. Right now, since we're on a keyboard, this false won't be read, which is exactly why I want to set it to false in here. Player 2 will default to false, player 1 will default to false, but player 1 will have this boolean set to true when setting up their controls. So whether we're keyboard or controls, our players will be determined correctly, and then we can use this for the input stack. So just to verify, once you've built, make sure you build solution and compile. I always say it because it's easy to forget, even for me. Like, I forgot to just mention it there. So make sure you compile. And then once you have your changes here, type for is player 1. It should pop up right here. Grab it, drag off of it, and look for the branch right here. Now, we already had this one in here, P1 add input image. And I didn't change anything with this function. Just duplicate the function. You can right-click on this one, duplicate, and then rename it. And I called it P2 add input image. So here's P1 and here's P2. They're the exact same function, except there's 2 differences. So for difference 1, I'm using P1 icon images, and in P2 add input image, I'm using P2 icon images, which you're like, yeah, duh. But it's true. This is something you have to note. So the P2 icon images is what it sounds like. Array of input stack icon object references. If you remember from the first episode, these objects, I can find them. These objects are just a single image that we are changing which one. We're changing the image, and then we're adding it to the array of them, basically the container of them that we have in this input stack that's on the HUD. So we have to make sure we have separate ones for both player 1 and 2, because if we're adding them to the same, then every time you do something in player 2's input, it's going to go to player 1's images, and same with player 1 going to player 2's images. We don't want that. So make sure, if you already had P1 icon images, that you add a second one here and have P2 icon images. Then, after you've set your brush and determined which one it is, we also have to determine where we want to add this to. So we want to add it to the appropriate player's input stack. On the HUD, P1 inputs is our name of the player 1 container that we had. So we were using P1 inputs. Well, in P2 add input images, guess what? We want to use P2 inputs. Simple enough. And here, I'll space this out just so it's a little bit nicer. But there you go. Now, since we'll have both of these on the HUD reference as long as you copy the P1 inputs over. So literally just drag off your HUD reference and search for P2 inputs. Right there. So just make sure you use P2 icon images here as well, because obviously we were inserting them here and I told you to switch it, but also when we're adding the children here to determine what our new input stack looks like, this also has to be P2 icon images for player 2. So again, it's all the same code, or all the same blueprints. You don't have to change anything, but I just want to make known you do have to change, you have to switch out those variables. You don't have to change any logic, I should say. Okay, simple enough. One final thing that you might want to note, so if you duplicated the function, you're good to go. Your local variable should also come over this icon image array, which holds all the objects that we've got, all the icons that we've got. Make sure that you add your icons. So for both player 1 and player 2, your new functions, at this point going forward, anytime you add new icon images, it's not going to stay because they're local variables, so they're local to this function. So you could break this out. You don't need this to be a local variable anymore. I kept it as a local variable just because I happened to finish player 1 first and then duplicated this, so everything came over to the P2 add input image function. But if you need to add some to 1 or 2, it might be easier to just break this out of a local variable, put it in your regular variables for your character, and then just access that. It won't hurt anything. In fact, it's probably easier. Again, I made it this way last time and just didn't need to change it because of the time I duplicated it. But if you feel like you're going to be needing to change a lot of these in the future, or you're just using temp assets or whatever, feel free to break it out into regular variable and then use it from there. And here's a good time to mention, in this array, make sure you add your new images. So I've added my diagonal images to 9, 10, 11, and 12. All you have to do is click this little plus here to add a new element, and then you can click the arrow, and then you can select the image. So like I already selected them, right? But I can do up left arrow, and then he's here. Then if you want to get rid of one, you click on the little down pointing arrow triangle thing, and just hit delete. So once you put in all your images, I've got these guys, I've got the 3 exceptional attacks, and the block image. Once these images are all in and good to go, then you're golden. You can access these from anywhere in the code. So all we have to do now, it's quite simple, is determine the logic we want to use for figuring out when to display these symbols to the screen. It's the same thing we did before, just we have to do diagonals, which is, it can be a little bit weird to think about, and we just need to simply add the blocking input and the exceptional attack input. So let's start with the easy ones. Let's start with the blocking and the exceptional attack. For blocking, in the start blocking function we have, literally just call add input icon to screen with the ID. Remember, this is the ID of the icon we want to use. So the icon we want to use is 16, index 16, which is the block image. Okay, so easy enough, simple. And as you can imagine, exceptional attacks are also pretty simple. If you have 3 like I do, 1 for each of your special attacks, light, medium, and heavy, then when you determine if it's a light exceptional attack, medium exceptional attack, or heavy exceptional attack, then you just display that proper icon to the screen once you verify that they have enough super meter to use it. Okay. Now, the harder part of this is the diagonals. They're not too bad, but we do have to kind of figure out how we want to set them up. So let's start with the jump. The jump's a little bit easier than the crouch. So in jump, we are checking if we can move, because can move is like if you're stunned or things like that. So we were checking to see if we could move, and then we were calling a character jump, and then setting our character state to be jumping. We were also adding our input icon to the screen, which was the up arrow. Now that's perfect. That logic doesn't need to change. We just need to add a little bit more to make it a little bit more diverse. So if we're jumping, but we're also moving to the left or moving to the right, then we know we need to display another icon to the screen. And since we don't want duplicates, like if you're jumping up and to the right, you probably don't want to have the up arrow and then the diagonal right arrow, unless you intentionally pressed up and then up and right. But since not a lot of inputs are going to revolve up and right other than jumping, it doesn't really make sense to display that input to the screen. So what I've done is just added an if statement, simple enough. I check our character state, see if the character is moving left. If they're moving left, and remember, we're in the jump function, so we already know we're jumping at this point. So if we're moving left and we're jumping, well then we want the up back arrow, or the up left arrow. And as you can see, index 9 is that. So I should be calling index 9 here, and I am. Add input icon to screen with index 9. Else, if the character state is moving right. So if we're moving right and we're jumping, then we want the up right arrow. And you can see index 10 is up right. So there you go. Else, meaning we're not in the moving left or moving right state, we're in any other state, but we're jumping, then we want to add 0, the 0 index of this array. And that's because that's the straight up and down arrow. We're not moving left or right, at least not intentionally. You know, you might get pushed back or something. But so we don't want diagonal arrows. We're jumping straight up. Simple enough. There you go. That'll take care of that. And luckily enough, that'll actually take care of that for both keyboard and controllers, because this isn't relating to anything that you press specifically. Just if the character is going into their jump function, we can determine this logic. Now, we're just going to have to determine the crouching logic. So, in our move right function, and if you remember, we have both move right and move right controller because we're supporting both. So they're very, very similar. I've just changed some of the values here and left it open in case you guys would like to change anything for controllers or for keyboards, since they can be complex. So in our move right, this is for the keyboard. You can tell because is device for multiple players. We're looking to see if it's true. Device for multiple players, meaning multiple people are playing on this keyboard. So if this is true, we want to go ahead and look to see if the player is doing any sort of crouch left and crouch right. Now, take note, you don't have to be completely crouching to do this, because maybe you're trying to do quarter circle or something. Now on a keyboard, you can't really do quarter circle. You have to do specifically like down and then right, or down and then left. You know, there is a moment where you could hold them both like that, and you could get the down right and right effect on the input stack if you want. But there's no way to actually have like a diagonal on your keyboard. So what we're going to do is we're going to check in the moving right function and the moving left function if they're crouching. That way we know they're pressing a direction and they are currently in the crouch state, which is the state that we want them to be in for them to do that action. Okay, so at the bottom of move right, well, at the top here we're checking if can move and character state not equal to crouching. So we want to click right in front of this bracket, this curly brace, this curly bracket, and then we want to go down and follow this to the end. You'll see another blue curly bracket here. So as soon as that's done, we want to have an else if. And this is the new stuff that I've added. I haven't changed anything in this top part. All that logic is fine. But since we were checking specifically if the character was not crouching, we don't want to do the logic in here. So immediately after that, else if can move and character state is crouching. So if the character is crouching, still check if the values are above these certain thresholds. Because if you don't check this, remember, move right is always getting called. It's an axis mapping. So even a value of 0 says, hey, I'm 0, I need to call the move right function. So we need to make sure they're above certain values. On a keyboard, doesn't really matter. That's why I have it as 0.01 and negative 0.001. But what we need to do is, if we're crouching and the value of move right is one of these values, then we know it's a diagonal input. We're holding both down and either left or right. So grab your values and set the icons accordingly. You can see it's basically the same logic we have here to set if we're moving left or right, except I'm not setting any character states. So I'm simply determining if the button has been released or not, and giving them the icon index that we want. Add input icon to screen. Again, same event we've been calling that adds the icons to the input stack. If the value is greater than 0.01. Now remember, the value that we have here is the parameter from the move right function. So it's how far we've pressed either left or right, or A or D, or whatever we have. So on our keyboard, I have A and D to move. So if the value is greater than 0.1, we're going to the right. We're pressing D on the keyboard, and it's greater than 0.01. So it basically just means on a keyboard, I'm pressing D. Simple enough. For player 2, this is pressing the right arrow key for me. So he's crouching, and he's pressing right. The value is greater than 0. So we want to display the down right arrow, which is 12 for me. Index 12. Otherwise, if the value is less than negative 0.01, then we are crouching and we're holding either the A key or the left arrow key. We're trying to move to the left. So we add input icon to screen, index 11, and we display the down left arrow. Now, the has released access input stuff is something I covered in the last episode. I'm using these to not flood the input stack with left or right when you press keys. That way it only displays if we should display it, if we've released the key. Otherwise, it would just print about 30,000 left or rights. Now, you can go ahead and copy this entirely. We're going to go ahead and place this down here in the move right controller function. It's the same exact logic. Don't change anything else. Find where we're looking and making sure we're not crouching, follow it down, and add an else if. Now I'm going to go ahead and change this because I forgot to, since I copied and pasted, but it should really look like this, not 0.01. Because remember, on the controller we want a little bit of forgiveness. We don't want it to be so static. We want it to be 0.2 in the right or 0.2 in the left direction before we move. But otherwise, it's the exact same logic. We add the correct inputs to screen based on the value that we are inputting on our controller. And there you go, guys. So that's all the logic and code I've got for you. So we're golden. Basically, you'll have full input now displayed to the screen for both player 1 and player 2. You can see I can crouch down. I can press right, right, left, left. I can jump and do straight up and down arrows. I can jump and to the right if I start moving that way and do an upright arrow. Same for player 1. Or I can jump backward for player 1 and do an up left. And I can jump forward for player 2, which is an up left. So I have full control over if we're doing up, down, left, right, or the diagonals in between for our inputs. This will work on keyboard and controller. We have blocking inputs now. You can see they get added to the icon stack accordingly. We have our exceptional attacks, our regular attacks. So pretty much everything that we can account for has been accounted for in the input stacks. Now, there will be something for grapples, of course. Grapple is going to be an input, so they will have their own icon. But again, that will be added in like the grapple episode. We don't need to do a separate input stack episode on that. So that'll probably be good for the input stack episodes. If you have anything else you want me to cover specifically for input stacks, then let me know. We will be disabling these outside of practice mode, or unless for whatever reason you want them on in your game mode outside of practice. So don't worry about that. We'll already cover that in an episode down the line. In the next episode, we're going to be going over, as I mentioned before, multiplayer menus. And just menus in general where we're passing data along. So right now what we're doing is we have a game mode, and we select our character, and it passes data to the game mode for when we load in the scene, who we should spawn and stuff based on who we selected on the character select screen. What we should be doing is having a first and second player in the game state that's getting passed along when we select our characters, when we're going through the menu. This will also help us save our skins, like what skin selection we made, so we know what our characters should look like when we spawn in. We'll be covering that in the next episode. We'll probably even do controller menu input, but we'll see. Depends on how long that other episode gets. Alright guys, so thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope this helped you. If it did, please subscribe. It helps me more than anything else you can do for the channel, and I just really appreciate it. Lets me know that I'm doing a good job in teaching you guys. I want to really thank everyone who's been following this series so far and just giving me support. So at this point, we've actually become YouTube partners under the educational program, so we've basically been recognized as an educational channel. So I just want to say thanks a lot. This is a really, really great honor for me, and I really appreciate it that you all supported me and gave me this opportunity. So thank you so much for the support. And yeah, that's all I got for today, guys. So if you have any questions or have any issues with this video or any of my other episodes, feel free to join the Discord. I can't put it in an iCard, but it is in the description. Just look for Discord, click the link, and you'll be in. We'll be happy to help you with any of the issues you had. Lastly, guys, if you want to come support me on Twitch, twitch.tv/Shawnthebro27. We play Dark Souls games on Wednesday and Resident Evil games on Friday. So that's a lot of fun. We've been actually starting the Old Iron Keep DLC in Dark Souls 2, and we're about to finish Resident Evil 7 for the first time. So very excited about those. Okay, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, my friends.